So, in the next paragraph, what Shelley has done is he has extended the meaning of poetry to encompass, to include ultimately or broadly other social institutions and systems of thought which usually are seen or which are otherwise seen as belonging to the realm of reason or belonging to the realm of rationality or scientific. So he asks for a general annulment of, a general removal of the distinctions between poems and other non-linguistic things that might preclude the more limited definition of poetry. And by drawing out these analogies, by drawing out these comparisons which are implicit in the defense, which are implicit in the defense with other arts, other social institutions, he is in a way merging poetry with other forms of human activity.
And I'll continue with the reading of the text. That is the next line. But poets, or those who imagine and express this indestructible order, are not only the authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and painting. They are the institutors. They are the institutors of laws and the founders of civil society and the inventors of the art of life and the teachers who draw into a certain kind of propinquity with the beautiful and the true, that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world, what is called religion. So let's first break down this first line with poets who imagine and express this indestructible order. So previously we were reading about this sense of approximation which is highest in the poet. What is that sense of approximation? To be able to see things in their analogies, to be able to see things in its closeness, what proximity lies between two objects when they are compared together, or when any mimetic experience takes place, or many mimetic representation takes place, how close it is, how far wide it is or close it is to its original composition or to its original object. This is what, if we regard someone as a poet, he or she would have the highest sense of perception into it. And this, what he says, this indestructible order. Now, what was this order? This order was nothing but the existence of certain rhythms and order and some sort of symmetry or uniformity that lies between the mimetic object and the natural object. So if you're trying to carry out any imitation, so imitation is something to the original one. So when that imitation takes place, how close is that imitation? You will try and unravel its parts, and those parts are nothing but certain degree of uniformity you'll find between the original and the artificial, or the original and the mimetic one. So this sense of proximation, the poet has the maximum. To be able to gauge, to be able to judge this sense of approximation, how close it is, how far distant it is, the kind of order or uniformity that exists between these two objects, the original object and the mimetic one. How close is that? That is the sense of approximation. And this is what he analyzes, what a poet analyzes is this sense of order and uniformity and the symmetry that exists from the original to the mimetic. So that's why when he says, let's get back to the reading, but poets, or those who imagine and express this indestructible order. So when he says the poets are those who imagine and express this indestructible order, these are not only the authors of language, they are also of music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and painting. They are the institutors of law, they are also the founders of... So basically he finds poetry in all these other institutions and art forms of music, dance, architecture, painting and even civil laws, or institutors of laws. Why? Because they are nothing but inventors of life. They have contributed creatively in the sense they have discovered or added or created something new for the expansion of human civilization. And let me also tell you how poets were originally, although the rest of these people, such as the civil society founders or the institutors of law or other physicians, they had been somewhere the inventors, but they cannot be regarded as poet. Poetry, he says, in the restricted sense, something which uses the language and metrical composition, or he, particularly from the passage, he says that it necessarily include those arrangements of language. What is poetry? anything which includes arrangements of language, especially the metrical language, which are created by imagination. So all these rest of the creators, or maybe the authors of revolution, or those who have reasonably with reason, they have pointed out the philosophies of reason or human existence, or the fact that how human beings originated. They all are somewhere the creators, the inventors, but they do fall into this expansive definition of poetry because they have creatively contributed to human civilization, but they all cannot be regarded as poets only. Why? Because poets were the makers in the sense that they used language to teach these laws, these codes of civil behavior. They were the ones who, their metrical composition, or with the arrangement of that metrical composition, they indirectly brought out these rules of civil conduct in human life. They brought out the laws in general sense. Now the question is, how is that possible? How have poets originally brought out the laws, civil laws, or the general conduct of human life, something that we regard in religion, or probably the civil laws? The answer is, when the civilization started to emerge throughout the world, the earlier known texts were written by certain poets. How? So the earlier known texts, for example, if we take it from the civilization of Mesopotamia, and the work was the Epic of Gilgamesh, that was in 2100 BC, or later on 1700 BC, or 1700 to 1100 BC, we had the Rig Veda, first of 4 Hindu sacred texts, that is called 4 Vedas. The first one was Rig Veda, and then in the area in the eastern side of the world, the Book of Changes emerged. The Book of Changes, that was more about the Confucian philosophy, and it was again a book of history, book of wisdom, book of poetry, about a kind of model of wisdom, or model of wise counsel, that was primarily used by China. Then they also wrote this 5 classics, that was again the part of the Confucian canon of writing. Then in 9th and 4th century, we had the great Sanskrit epics Mahabharata and Ramayana. Then 8th century saw the ancient Greek epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. And then later on, we saw in 29 BC Virgil's own masterpiece, Aeneid. And then later on, again, there was quite a few important seminal work in Chinese poetry as well, the Shi tradition of Chinese poetry. So if you go back to history and see how and when human civilization emerged, they all emerged through certain narrations, and these narrations were primarily in epic forms earlier. So epics were narrative poems, and these epics would usually recount someone's story, a story of the hero who would represent a particular culture, who would represent his quest, his ordeals, his pains and his gains throughout his journey. And these epics would also account for what kind of choices that particular hero made, or what motives he or she, not she, but he had. So they were trying to, through these epic narrations, through this epic poetry, they were trying to establish and codify the moral principles of society. The fact that the Helen of Troy, when she was kidnapped, wasn't seen very pleasurable action, and as a result of this abduction, the war took place. So what morals would someone draw? And even later on in other epics, it was shown how if a woman of a particular community would be kidnapped, revenge would be taken up in the form of war. So one moral code, one moral principle was established, that it is unethical, it is immoral to have an evil eye over the women of other communities. So this is how the poets somewhere established these unwritten, these unsaid moral codes and principles, which were later on in different ages, as the civilization started to emerge, as the languages started to evolve. It was later on finally codified in the writing form, in the language part, using different forms of language, or different new disciplines were created. For example, law was created by, say, certain group of people. Now, if I resume the reading, but poets are those who imagine and express this indestructible order, and they're not the only authors of language. They're also the authors of music, of dance, and architecture, and statuary, and painting, and institutors of laws, and the founders of civil societies, and the inventors of arts of life. So here he has clearly expanded and enlarged, augmented this idea of poetry, this meaning of poetry. But later on, he would also say that particularly poetry in language, in writing, refers to, or in parts how it is sung, it refers to that arrangement of language which uses a metrical part, which uses a metrical composition. But at the same time, poetry was also very expansive. How? EXPANSIVE, expansive. How? Because it included all arts of life. And why are they included in poetry? Because for him, poetry stood for anything that contributed creatively to the expansion of human civilization, for the human civilization to evolve. But these professions and these artists were limited. Why? Because they could not move beyond the level of imagination. And this is where Mr. Poet comes in and uses his imagination with the use of language and composes a metrical food, using various figures of speech, using various elements of metaphors and allegories, and that's how he composes a poem. And let's read further. Then he says that the teachers who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true, that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world, which is called religion. So the teachers who draw into a certain, by teachers he meant the prophets and the sages, who draw into a certain propinquity. Propinquity again means approximation, the state of being close to someone or something, the state of proximity. So these teachers or the prophets who draw into certain proximity with the beautiful world and the truth, that the partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world. Now, religion, so what does religion do? So he says these prophets and sages, they somewhere through their figurative representation of truth, they bring out the elements of the invisible world. They kind of create a kind of transcendental experience. How? With the use of its own commandments and edicts and the so-called divine rule. They explain these aspects of the invisible world, of the other world, of the transcendental world. And that is why all original religions are not real, but they are more like allegorical. They are symbolic. They are just this figurative representation of the truth. They are just the figurative representation of a world or of different agencies that exist in that invisible world, of that mystical world. And then in the middle of this paragraph, he says, a poet participates in the internal, the infinite, the infinite, and the one, as far as relates to his conceptions. Time and place and number are not related to his conception. So that's the reason a poet participates in the internal, the infinite, and the one. He is able to write about those transcendental experiences of those various agencies of the invisible world, of the metaphysics that may not be just can be accounted for, or that cannot be just recorded in these other professions or these men of science. We moved on to the next paragraph and the third line of the next paragraph. Yet it is by no means essential that a poet should accommodate his language to this traditional form, so that the harmony which is its spirit be observed. The practice is indeed convenient and popular, and to be preferred, especially in such compositions as includes much action. But these are the important lines, but every great poet must inevitably innovate upon the examples of his predecessors in the exact structure of his peculiar versification. Now, this is very much a thought in continuation of what Aristotle has proposed initially, that all these metrical forms, different adoption of metrical forms that we see in different era. Now, if we in hindsight look back and see, what Aristotle proposed was absolutely correct, that poetry got invented in the age that it got demanded. Poetry came out of the demands of the age, and the various forms of these versification, or in its subset, if subgenres that exist in poetry, the subset of this genre called poetry, they also emerge as per the demands of it. So if in some age, say dactylic hexameter was considered, or trochee dectameter was considered, or hexameter, trochee hexameter and dactylic hexameter, if they were the preferred form, metrical form over the other, then that was the demand of the times. And in other places, in different era, if blank verse was needed, much needed in the form of versification or as the metrical form, then again it was a demand of the time. Let's read it again. But now the role or the duty of the great poet is to understand the very vibe of that particular age and decidedly go for the right metrical form in that age itself. So if these poets, it can be rightly said that if Wordsworth is accusing Pope or Dryden or his followers of the likability of neoclassical trends, then it was wrong, because that was something the demand of the times. England has been freshly restored to the power of Charles II, and because of this restoration thing, everything was restored back. And as a result of this restoration, when Mr. Charles II had inherited much of his manners from France, it was rightly adopted as form of the poem itself, to be imitating the French master, to be imitating the classical masters, and major trend of the Europe, or major trend of this French writers has also been to copy their French master. That is how the form of neoclassicism came here as well. So it was rightly done in those times. But what Wordsworth criticized was, after Pope and Dryden and the likes of Mr. Pope or their followers have written certain pieces, that form had ceased to exist. Beyond that, it was just a inferior level of imitation. It was just a gross or vulgar level of imitation which should be avoided, and therein it left room for new form of metricality. So let's continue with the reading. Yet it is by no means essential that a poet should always accommodate his language to this traditional form. I hope this is clear now. But every great poet must I'm quoting from the text now. Every great poet must inevitably innovate upon the examples of his predecessors in the exact structure of his peculiar versification. Now, the next line says, the distinction between poets and prose writers is again a vulgar error. This is very much in similar vein to what Wordsworth has said. Poetry, the best of the poetic pieces are more like prose, and the best of prose pieces appear poetic. The distinction between philosophers and poets has also been anticipated. Plato was essentially a poet. The truth and splendor of his imagery and the melody of his language are the most intense that is possible to conceive. He rejected the measure of epic, dramatic, the lyrical forms. All these things we have studied in Aristotle. The epic form, the dramatic form, and the lyrical form. But Plato, he sought to kindle a harmony in thoughts and divested of shape and action, and he forbore to invent any regular plan of rhythm which would include under determinate forms the varied pauses of his style. On the one hand, Plato has openly criticized, openly condemned poetry as catering to base emotions or lower emotions, and he also referred to it, writing poetry as indulging in some sort of divine madness. But for Plato, the dangers of poetry lied in the fact that those who turn to poetry as some sort of revelation of God, these people, they fail to differentiate between the truth of poet's experience, that poetry is nothing but a second-hand account of what you call as revelation of poet. Somehow this is true. The poet, although he has this hyper-acute sensibility, he can receive these indestructible orders. He can orders as in the uniformity, the structure I'm talking of, not some divine orders. He can perceive, he can sense this approximation towards the best of the objects in a better manner in comparison to other men. But that is again a kind of poet's experience of the truth. So it is somewhere twice negated from reality. One is, of course, reality is getting itself imitated, and that imitation, although the poet tries his best to be as closer as possible, but it is again nothing but the truth of poet's experience. And second, so we were coming back to, let's get back to Plato, when he says that the dangers of poetry is when you regard poetry or when you see it as a revelation of God. Why? Because you have to understand that the truth of the poet's experience on the one hand and the probable account of that experience on the other. These are two different things. And this is where Shelley saw a problematic thing with Plato, because although he again regarded Plato as a poet, and he accepts that the truth of the experiences are somehow recorded in the dialogues. But he says, what you're talking of the probable account, what Mr. Plato was talking of the probable account of that experience. So the poet, for example, poet like Wordsworth, he had some sort of mystical experience. He experiences some transcendental experience. Now, definitely as a transcendental experienced person, he'd like to write it in the form of verse. When he wrote it in the form of verse, one is the truth of that poet's experience, which exists, which he has experienced himself. The second is nothing but, the moment it is written in form of poetry, it is nothing but a probable account. Now, this is what problematic Mr. Shelley found with Plato, although he regarded him as a poet, and he said he was again essentially a poet, but the truth of the experiences recorded in the dialogues, they are far more better than what you call a probable account. Because what Mr. Plato was regarding these probable accounts were nothing but as some sort of rationalistic formulation. A rationalistic formulation of these poets' experiences that he regarded, these are nothing but probable ones. So Shelley regarded Plato as poet as long as he indulges or he regards his convictions towards poetry as some pure imaginative intuition. But the moment Plato started to prioritize, or Plato started to regard poetry as some sort of rationalistic systemization or rationally trying to break it down and formulate it, then he was somewhere disagreeing. He was in a way conveying his mistrust on this statement or this part of Plato. So he regarded Plato as a poet as per his broader definition of poetry. If you remember that broader definition and the restrictive definition of poetry, these were two different things. Broader definition of poetry was that everything that is ever being created, invented by different men, they all were somewhere poets. And restricted sense of poetry, or the restrictive definition of poetry, was whenever poetry used an arrangement of language which has some metrical foot or some metrical arrangement to it or some metrical systematization, that is precisely that becomes poetry. So that's how he very broadly defined in its expansion, he defined poetry. So he said that there are hardly any limits to poetry, and it is at once the center and circumference of knowledge. Poetry was at once the center and circumference of knowledge. Yet he drew another circle in between, and that smaller circle in the middle of it is that of poetry, which he says in the most restrictive sense, it refers to all the arrangement of language which has some metrical systemization, which has some metrical foot attached to it, using figures of speech or various metaphors or allegories or figurative part of language. And if you reread the text again, he says, the distinction between philosophers and poets has been anticipated. Plato was essentially a poet. Why? Plato was poet only because the truth and splendor of his imagery and the melody of his language are most intense that it is possible to conceive. So Plato was essentially a poet only because his imagery has some truth and some splendor, and there exists a melody in his language, and that melody is most intense, and it is so intense that it is impossible to conceive a similar melody in this kind.